Ambassador Douglas Suleiman, thank you very much for joining us and welcome to Rudaw Amro.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be on Rudaw TV, and I want to send my greetings to all of your viewers in the Kurdistan region and wherever they might be watching around the world.
Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to ask about the outcomes of Iraq-US strategic dialogue. How do you evaluate the outcome so far?
I think the outcome is going to be good for Iraq and a more balanced policy from the United States. During the Trump administration, when this round of the strategic dialogue with Iraq began, the Trump administration's policy toward Iraq was very much focused on putting additional pressure on Iran. And there was much less of an independent American policy dealing with Iraq or Iraqi issues. I think that President Biden, who really had charge of the Iraq file when he was vice president under Barack Obama, knows a lot more about Iraq and has a lot of ideas about having an independent Iraq policy, or an Iraq policy that is not simply a subset of its Iran policy. The part of the strategic dialogue that has gotten all of the news is the agreement from the United States that all American combat forces will be withdrawn from Iraq by the end of this year. That's a fairly small accomplishment because American soldiers play very little of a combat role now in the fight against Daesh. And most combat forces left Iraq in 2017 and 2018 after the real defeat of Daesh. What is probably more important are some of the focuses on economics, on assistance, $155 million of new assistance, and promotion of commercial and trade deals between the United States and Iraq, with the recognition of the Biden administration that developing the Iraqi economy and helping diversify that economy and link it to the rest of the world will be as important for the future of Iraq as will the security situation itself.
So do you expect an escalation in terms of sectarian conflict after December 31st of 2021?
Boy, that's a very difficult question, and I wish I had a magic crystal ball to give you a clear answer. There is clear division in Iraq within the Shia community and among major Shia political parties. As everyone in the world saw during the demonstrations in Baghdad and the south, there is a real desire among many young Iraqis to create a new and different Iraqi identity. The phrase "Naridu Watan," we want a country, we want a homeland, was one of the themes of the demonstrations. And the demonstrations were neither secular nor religious. They were really national. They're looking for a country that they can be proud of. Iraqis are looking for a government that is more effective. And Iraqis are looking for an end to corruption that has made it difficult for them to move forward politically or economically. So I don't know that there will be sectarian competition after the end of December, but I'm pretty sure that there will continue to be a desire to see a different type of Iraqi government, and some people who would rather see a nationalist Shia government or who would rather see a more radical Islamist government like the remaining parts of Daesh in the country. I think they will be minority voices, but those are voices who will have guns and who have shown that they are willing to use violence in the past.
So do you expect stability or instability after 31st December?
I think I will see about the same as what you see now, a mixture of stability and instability. Since the United States plays a very small combat role in the fight against Daesh, you might see a little bit of change in the way that the Iraqi army or the Hashd al-Shabi or the Peshmerga actually confront Daesh after the 31st of December. But I don't think it's going to lead to instability. It might, in the short term, lead to an increase in attacks by Daesh on areas that they felt they could not attack if there was more a little bit more American support. But the reality is that the Iraqi army and the Peshmerga have really been carrying most of the burden of the fight against Daesh. The
I see.
question of violence from Shia militias in Iraq, from parts of the Hashd al-Shabi, will be less tied to December 31st, maybe tied more to the Iraqi elections in October, and frankly, the state of American-Iranian relations and the outcome of the current negotiations in Vienna over the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal.
So do you expect, so let me ask it this way, don't you expect more Iranian involvement after, when I say December 31st, I refer to the withdrawal of the combat missions of the US, which I know that you disagree. You say that the combat forces has not been there for a long time and that this is not a withdrawal. But the Iranian side and the Shiite the parties in the country celebrate this date as the date of like the finishing of the occupation. So don't you expect more Iranian involvement after this date?
I don't expect more Iranian involvement after this date. I think the Iranians understand the role of American forces in Iraq. Even the Iraqi government has been very clear that after the departure of US combat forces, there will still be American military trainers. There will still be American military advisors. There will continue to be American military assistance to the Iraqi army, to the counterterrorism service, to the Navy, the Air Force, to the Peshmerga, and this is not going to change. I think what you will see, if you see an increase in pressure from Iran or Shiite national or pro-Iranian militias in Iraq, it's likely to be a gradual uptick in attacks on Western targets, coalition targets, as we've seen in the past. I took the celebration of the decision to remove American combat forces as an attempt to declare victory when most of those Shia militias understand that the situation will change very little and that the United States will continue to have a military presence in Iraq, just not a presence that will be involved in combat in any way. And frankly, the combat forces that the United States had in the country were really only engaged in combat against Daesh, and only in very, very limited circumstances. It was much more a training and advising and assisting role from the end of the real war against Daesh in 2017.
Ambassador Silliman, it's not only the Shiites, but also the Sunnis are convinced that by the end of 2021, the US is going to withdraw from Iraq. 3 days ago, Athil Nujaifi, the former governor of Mosul, had a statement in which he said that after the withdrawal of the US forces in Iraq, we expect Turkey to be more involved in Iraq to create a balance between Iran and Turkey in Iraq. In this term, do you expect any sort of Turkish involvement, military involvement, especially in Mosul and other Sunni Arab and Turkmen areas in the country?
Well, it's clear that Turkey is already militarily involved in the northern part of Iraq. There are certainly Turkish forces in the Kurdistan region, in Duhok. There are Turkish forces in parts of Nineveh, very close to Bashika. And there have been Turkish air raids and Turkish incursions across the border into the mountains of the northern Kurdistan region.
I'm talking about an involvement in Sunni Arab areas, not in Kurdistan region.
Well, as I said, there is already involvement in Nineveh province, not very much yet in Mosul and in areas. What would be unfortunate is if some of the patterns that we saw in the 2018 elections were to repeat themselves, where candidates from one particular Sunni political party was sponsored by one outside government, a different political party, or a candidate was sponsored by another government. I would hate to see increased Turkish involvement in Sunni politics, mostly because it will have the effect of fracturing the strength of the Sunni vote. Again, I don't want to see Iraqi politics based only on sectarian divisions, but the reality thus far is that the geographic divisions, Anbar province and Nineveh province, Salahuddin, even Diyala, you have got significant Sunni political voices who are unhappy with various parts of the current political spectrum and may seek advantage for themselves and their message from outside forces. We think that that's a bad idea. I think that that's a bad idea to take money and support from outside countries. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen. The real question is going to be, will the Turks attempt to take advantage of the perception?
So that was the exact question that I wanted to ask you right now. What do you see? Does Turkey has such an agenda to seize this opportunity and create some sort of involvement in Iraq the way it has done in Syria in last years?
I think that the Turks will probably increase what they do in the far north of the Kurdistan region against the pockets of PKK fighters and PKK politicians who spent most of their time in the northern mountains. When those leaders come down to Mahmur, when those leaders come down to the cities of Kurdistan, it does put Kurdistan in greater danger because the Turks will be able to figure out where they have gone. The question is going to be, will this go down into Mosul? The Turkish military is already overextended in Syria. They have had to use their own proxy forces to work with them in Syria as they try to prevent, if you will, the expansion or the joining of the different parts of Rojava in northern Syria. I think that the Turks will look very carefully and very closely at what happens in the north of Nineveh province. And I think that they will be looking for opportunities. But again, they need an opportunity. They need some sort of incident. They need some sort of an invitation to do this. And again, if there is going to be a lot of political focus in Baghdad on foreign forces in Iraq, I think there will be a lot of attention paid to the presence, the long-term presence of Turkish forces in Iraq, which are in Iraq without the permission of the Iraqi government. So there will be a lot of political pushback from Baghdad, which will make it more difficult for the Turks to do in Iraq what they have done in Syria. It doesn't mean that they will not try to expand their presence, but it's a different political situation in Iraq than it is in Syria.
I see. Back to the U.S. foreign policy in regards to Iraq. There has been an idea from inside Iraq that the U.S. is fed up with Iraq and it's going to leave Iraq, and what we are witnessing today in Afghanistan is going to be what we are going to witness in upcoming year in Iraq. Do you share this idea, or you have a different point of view when it comes to the situation or the position of Iraq in the U.S. foreign policy?
Let me answer that question at the end of a complicated answer. What I want to do is lay out what I see as the foreign policy, or frankly, the overall policy of President Biden and his administration. President Biden's priorities coming into office are domestic priorities. His priorities are to fight the coronavirus, to get people more fully vaccinated, to plan for and support an economic recovery in the United States and create more jobs, and to help heal the very serious political divisions between Republicans and Democrats, but more generally within American society. These are the issues on which President Biden was elected, and this is where he is spending the vast majority of his time and his political capital. When he looks at foreign policy, his number one goal for foreign policy is to restore the strong alliances and relationships that the United States has in Europe and in Asia with Japan, South Korea, Australia. Relationships that were very much damaged by the Trump administration, who downplayed the importance of doing things with America's allies around the world. After restoring those alliances, the next priority is really looking at competition from China. economic competition, but also security competition in the Asia-Pacific basin, competition from Russia, and in the Middle East, maybe as a fourth or fifth priority, returning to the Iran nuclear deal. After those priorities, everything else is very, very small for President Biden, and he's not going to be spending a lot of time. So that's the context if you look at foreign policy issues. To my knowledge, there is not yet a written and fully developed or considered policy for Iraq, which most administrations do when they come in. They will be working on that, but the new Assistant Secretary for the Middle East at the State Department, who would normally be in charge of doing that, is not even yet in her seat. She's not been confirmed by the Senate. So it may be some more time before the written policies become more concrete. Now, the Afghanistan withdrawal is different from Iraq. There was an agreement between the Trump administration and the Taliban that American forces would be withdrawn from Afghanistan by the end of September. There were conditions on that, but President Biden has chosen to remove pretty much all forces in Afghanistan except those that will be there to protect the American embassy in Kabul. This is a different situation than in Iraq. Iraq for the United States is a much more strategically important country. It is the crossroads between Europe, Asia, and Africa. If you look at the history of the Tigris-Euphrates basin, this is where civilizations have met, developed, but also clashed for millennia. For the Biden administration and for President Biden particularly, he understands that stability in Iraq creates stability in the rest of the region, that prosperity in Iraq can help create prosperity in the rest of the region and even farther from the region because of Iraq's oil trade and the ability of Iraq were it to become a stronger market, a stronger producer of products other than oil, to influence the region and to be more productive. He also understands that there is competition inside Iraq, as there has been competition in Mesopotamia for thousands of years between different forces. Right now, it happens to be the government of Iran would very much like to see a Shia-dominated government in Iraq that is sympathetic to Iran. Turkey does not want to see a Shia-dominated government in Iraq, and Turkey has got and has defined its own interests. Israel is concerned about Iraq because Iran is pursuing its policy against Israel by shipping weapons, missiles, and fighters across Iraq through Syria to supply Hezbollah in Lebanon, and through other means to supply Hamas in Gaza. So there are a lot of aspects of Iraq policy which affect American interests and the stability of the region much more directly. And I would tell your viewers at Rudaw, you are not going to see a full American withdrawal from Iraq. What you're going to see is a continued American military presence to help strengthen the government in Baghdad, the army, the Navy, the Air Force, the counterterrorism service, the Peshmerga, to help strengthen legitimate government in Iraq, to help push back against pressure from Iran and pressure from those who are Shia nationalists and want to see an Iraqi government that is aligned with Tehran.
I see. Okay, back to Iraq. If you compare Iraq, today's Iraq, and the current situation in Iraq today to February 2019 when you left the country, what do you see?
I see greater pressure from Iran and the Shia militia and attempt to consolidate power, certainly politically through the electoral process, but there have been continued attempts to quite literally create an equivalent of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps inside Iraq. I remember at some point when I was in Iraq, I think it was 2018, when there were demonstrations in Basra in the south about electricity and water. There were attempts at that point to create a Basij, which they actually called Basij, in Basra, trying to get young volunteers. That failed. It appears now, and even if you look at statements from Faleh Fayyad, the head of the Hashd al-Shabi, they are looking at the Revolutionary Guard Corps as a model for the future of Iraq. What that means is they're looking at an Iranian-focused, Iranian-supported, and Shia nationalist group that will try to control the levers of government from outside of government. And they will obey the directions of the legitimate government when it serves their purposes, and they will simply ignore them when it does not. So what concerns me most about this is will be attempts by the Hashd al-Shaabi or political organizations or economic organizations associated with them who will try to take control of economic levers. They will try to get privatization of factories so that they can give jobs and expand their political support to a broader range of people, not just people who are on the payroll of the Hashd, people who will work in a factory, people who will work in a job that will now be run by some arm of the Hashd, as has happened in Iran. So what I see most is a real concerted effort by Shia political parties and militias to consolidate control over the government in Baghdad, piece by piece, over a significant amount of time.
So you tell me that during the last 2 or 3 years, you see a much more active Iran in Iraq and very strategic plans for the future of the Shiites in the country. And on the other side, you tell me that the US, until now, does not have a clear written policy about Iraq. In this case, do you see like Iraq becoming the second Iran in the Middle East in the next 10 years? And another way to ask the question is, does really the US have a strategy to stop Iran from making Iraq the second Iran in the Middle East?
Whether there is a specific strategy, I mean, what I will say, the policy of the United States toward Iraq will look very much like the policy of the United States toward Iraq over the course of the past 12 years. Most of the people who are in the Biden administration working on Middle Eastern foreign policy were also in the Obama administration. People like Brett McGurk, people like Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State. All of these people have experience with Iraq issues, and they are first and foremost trying to catch up from 4 years of an Iraq policy that was very focused on putting more pressure on Iran, but didn't really have any strengthening of the Iraqi government. So I think the basic strategy will remain what it used to be and what I just laid out. Try to help strengthen the Iraqi government, the Iraqi security services, and most importantly, the Iraqi economy. That is the best way to prevent an Iranian takeover or a Shia takeover of Iraq. Another strategy that will continue to be pursued. Yeah. The answer is that depends upon Iraqis. If Iraqis simply say, we will vote for the usual political parties that we have voted in the past, we will end our protests, we will not, those of us who are educated, who have the ability to go overseas and work in London or work in Australia and become doctors and lawyers and business people, if all the Iraqis who have real potential to help Iraq leave the country, if Iraqi money continues to be invested in apartments in Ankara and in Amman and in Abu Dhabi, then it may well lead to greater Iranian influence. I don't think that Iran will ever take over Iraq because there is simply there are too many differences between Iraqi culture and even the Iraqi interpretation of Shia Islam. But what I do see is if Iraqis give up on Iraq, the rest of the world is going to give up on Iraq. So we have to see Iraqis who invest in Iraq, Iraqis starting businesses in Iraq, Iraqis supporting government institutions, and Iraqis voting in elections for political parties who will push back against Iranian influence if that is what they want to see. So again, it's not dependent upon what the United States done. It's much more dependent upon what Iraq does. And the United States, I believe, will continue to support those Iraqis who want to see a truly independent and sovereign Iraq, and certainly will support those Iraqis who want to see a prosperous Iraq that is not only driven by sales of oil, but can have its own independent entrepreneurs and businesses that can provide jobs and wealth to Iraq in a new and different way.
Is Mustafa al Qaeda one of those Iraqis that you mentioned?
I think Mustafa al Qaeda is a good Iraqi in a positive sense. Although he is Shia, although he is from a very prominent religious family in Iraq, that helps give him legitimacy with those Shia who actually believe that their country should be run based on religious values. He also has experience in the West, and I think, and based on the conversations that I have had with him in the past and his conversations in Washington on his recent visit, he believes that the best way for Iraq to strengthen and become a truly strong and independent country with a prosperous economy is what I have just laid out, to open to the world. The prime minister, among other things, is largely responsible for reaching out to Iraq's Sunni Arab neighbors. The new triangle of leaders with the King of Jordan and the President of Egypt is something that appears to be of Mustafa Qademi's making. He has good relationships in Saudi Arabia, in Abu Dhabi, in Kuwait, in the rest of the Gulf, and he has good relationships in the United States and in Europe, where people see him not as the only person who can save Iraq, but the kind of Iraqi leader who is willing to balance Iraq's interests and maintain Iraqi integrity, maintain Iraqi sovereignty in the face of great pressures from many different sources, from Iran, from Turkey, to a large extent from the United States, and from the various factions within his own population. So I think that he has great support in Washington. It is going to be very interesting to see what happens in the elections in October, since he has.
We're going to talk about the elections, but before the elections, I would like to ask about Muqtada al-Sadr. Do you think he can play a role of a barrier in front of that, what you called an Iraqi takeover in Iraq, an Iranian takeover in Iraq?
I think Muqtada al-Sadr is most concerned with Muqtada al-Sadr and the success of his own movement. I think that he saw the demonstrations in 2019 and 2020 as taking over a part of his political space. He always wants to be the political leader who is outside of the government, the one who criticizes the ability of the government to provide services or to criticize the government for its missteps, but does not want to be politically responsible for what is happening in the government, even though he has made great efforts to put his supporters and members of his party into significant positions in the government. I think that he was shaken a bit by the strength of the demonstrations. And I think that he now wants to tap into some of the sentiment that you saw on the streets of Baghdad and Nasiriyah and other places in the south, in Najaf, rejecting the current system of government. So I think he wants to try again to work from outside the political system. I was surprised by his announcement of boycotting the elections, and that could make it more difficult. It'll make it more crucial for those leaders who do not want to see a takeover of the next government by parties aligned with Iran to work together. So for Kurdish parties, for Sunni parties, for moderate Shia parties, they will have to work more closely together because they are not likely to have the large block of votes if Sadr's election boycott continues, helping in that direction.
Do you think it's going to continue?
He will not be the arbiter of the next government. I'm sorry?
Do you think it's going to continue, or Sadr is going to get back to the election?
That's a good question. I honestly don't know. The way that he ran his campaign and conducted his negotiations after the 2018 elections gave him the strongest position for the formation of the new government. I think that that is something that he certainly would like to have. He will have to balance these two different political initiatives. Does he want to be the political force that is the arbiter, the negotiator between sort of a more secular and diverse Iraqi government and a more Shia nationalist or pro-Iran government, the position that he had in 2018? Or does he want to be the one who says, I am coming in from outside, I know what is best, and this system is corrupt and we must bring down the whole system? I personally expect the Sadrists to participate in the elections in October, but I'm not very certain of my inclination. I feel that they will. If they don't, I think it'll cause a much lower turnout. It might throw the elections themselves into some sort of doubt about their legitimacy, and it will certainly mean that the political parties that have the strongest organization, I mean, in Kurdistan, it's the KDP, the PUK, in other parts of the country where there is a tribal connection, a prominent individual, or a militia behind a political party where they have the organizational skills to bring their voters to vote. Those will be the parties that will be successful in the elections and win most of the shares of the parliament. The parties representing, for example, the protesters. There are a couple of political organizations that seem to be trying to capitalize on the sentiment of the protests. They're generally not very well organized, and they don't have a political structure and a history on the ground in people's neighborhoods that can convince them to go to the polls or compel them to go to the polls. So I think that if Sadr withdraws, it changes the tenor of the election, and it keeps a lot of Sadr's supporters away from the polls.
So, and exactly at this point, is the elections going to bring stability or more instability in the country?
I think it's going to bring more of the same. What I saw in the results of the 2018 elections are a few more political forces who were not asking people to vote based on their religion or their geography. I am hoping that this election will show the development of new political parties or the changing of political parties focused on issues that are most important to Iraqis, but issues not on religion and not on a person's hometown or province. Ultimately, democracy will be more successful in Iraq if the political messages are cross-cutting. For example, if a political party talks about the need to strengthen government services to reduce the political appointments inside government, that may appeal to a certain segment of the population, and it may appeal to Kurds and to Sunnis and to Christians and Yazidis and Shia and others. That has to be the future of democracy in Iraq. I believe that there will be significant political forces that have agendas that are based on issues that are important to Iraqis, economic agendas, security agendas that are focused on better performance of the government. If this election brings forward a political movement that has sprung out of the protests, if this election can bring together a coalition of existing political parties to talk about issues, that will be one step in the right direction. If this election ends up with political representatives of Shia militias and political representatives of the major Kurdish parties and political representatives of the major Sunni tribes and families, you will see more of the same and a continued dysfunctional parliament, and again, a very, very long period of formation of the next government as people try to figure out how a new prime minister and a new cabinet will be chosen.
Okay. Now, I'm sure you're aware of the PMF-related, the Hashd-related militias, rockets, and drone attacks on Erbil. And, you know, the U.S. and coalition bases in Erbil became targets of these militias, rocket and drone attacks. Do you find the measures taken by the U.S. against these militias sufficient?
It's going to be very difficult to take actions against the militias. The militias are in a gray area. They are both non-state actors and state actors at the same time. There are parts of the Hashd al-Shabi which are part of the Iraqi security forces. They tend to be Shia nationalists, but not all of them are. There are also significant parts of the Hashd al-Shabi which have formed smaller factions where they simply disobeyed the orders of the government. And this is where most of the attacks on coalition forces and the ones in Erbil have come from. Groups like Kataib Hezbollah, Shuhada.
Shuhada?
Thank you very much. It was escaping me. These kind of groups have splintered into groups with new names, which don't really mean much of anything except to shield the larger groups from any responsibility for the actions of these groups. It is likely that there will be more of these attacks. What the US is trying to do is develop, frankly, better defenses against the kinds of weapons that these militias use. Most of these weapons come directly from Iran, or they have transferred the technology from Iran to these militias to manufacture in other locations. And Iraq is not the only place where this is happening. You see this in Syria. You've seen this in Lebanon,
Saudi
with
Arabia,
Hezbollah,
even
in Gaza
Israel.
with Hamas, with the Houthis in Yemen. In Afghanistan, you may see this as well. So there is a broader Iranian desire for what we in the United States would call a forward defense. Iran protects itself from foreign involvement by trying to take the fight outside the borders of Iran, into Iraq, into Syria, into Yemen, into Lebanon, into Gaza, into Israel, and farther away. So I expect that there will be more attacks like this. I don't think that American military retaliation is a particularly effective response. And I think that the Trump administration, by defining, as they did publicly, that there will be a military response if there is a death of an American, simply caused these militias to work harder to try to kill an American. I think the Biden administration is trying to develop a more nuanced deterrence where they have responded to 25 or 26 attacks from Shia militias on U.S. coalition forces or the U.S. Embassy with, I believe, only 2 or 3 military responses. What they want to do is make sure that the militia leaders don't know when the United States is going to respond. They will try to hold the Iranian government responsible to some extent. And it is possible at some point that there will be retaliation inside Iran, but it is more likely, especially now that there will not be U.S. Forces in Iraq, that there will be greater cooperation in Iraq with the Iraqi government, with the counterterrorism service, with the army, with the parts of the federal police that we trust and work with the Peshmerga, that will work more directly against these shadowy groups. It's also possible that the United States or other friends of the United States, like Israel, will continue attacks, particularly in Syria, that will weaken the ability of these groups to extend their supply lines and project Iranian strategic influence through Iraq into Syria and into Lebanon. So I think what you have seen over the past 2 or 3 years will probably continue, and it will go up and it will go down based on the political situation. Maybe one last comment on this. The Biden administration would like to change the relationship of the United States with Iran. This may be difficult now that Ibrahim Raisi has been elected the president of Iran, and the conservative factions in Iran really do control all of the levers of the government in Iran right now, although the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, certainly is the one who has made most of the major decisions. The Biden administration would like to find a way to bring Iran back into the international community in a productive way, to get past the expansionist, violent export of the Iranian Revolution that started in 1979, and that is very much a part of their forward defense, pushing their fight outside of the borders of Iran.
Yeah.
I don't know how this might happen. I don't think this is going to happen in the short term, but it is clear to me that the Biden administration, especially as it seeks to get back into the JCPOA, wants to develop a relationship with Iran that is not one of friendship, but does not have to be one of conflict, and find ways to convince Iran that it is not in Iran's interest to continue activities that destabilize Iran's neighbors and destabilize countries farther away from Iran. That there will always be a cost to Iran for continuing these policies. So I think that's
Ambassador
where
Suleiman,
the
but
Biden
at this
administration
point,
would like to go.
yeah, why it's not in interest of Iran? Because what I have understood from your answers, the strategies which were adopted by the US in last 20 years has helped Iran to be much more effective and influential in the area, in the whole Middle East. And on the other hand, from your answers, also I understand that the US has failed to counter what you call maybe the Iranian risk or threat in the area. So in this case, how can the US convince Iran to stop what it's doing while Iran is getting more interests and gets more than it is bargained for, and the US is much more ready to compromise?
Well, it depends upon how you define Iranian interests. And again, I think in Iran, you'll have different people defining interests in different ways. For example, in his address when he was sworn in as president 2 weeks ago, or last week, President Raisi said that he was going to bring reforms and use diplomacy to make a difference on the dinner tables of Iranian citizens. He wants to increase the prosperity that Iranian citizens feel or felt years ago before the economic pressure on Iran increased. There is a lot of political pressure from inside Iran for the Iranian government to be more effective, more efficient. It's not all that dissimilar from what you see in Iraq. It's just that the Iranian government puts down the demonstrations in Iran with much greater violence and arrests, thousands and thousands of demonstrators, not just a few hundred.
I see.
I don't say that this is going to be easy. The question is going to be, is a military solution really the only solution? It is clear.
And let me ask that
American
question
politics,
this way, Ambassador Suleiman. Do you share the idea that the US strategy has failed against Iran in controlling or limiting its role and influence in the Middle East?
I don't think the American strategy, as originally conceived by President Bush and President Obama, has failed. The strategy changed radically when President Trump came in, and Trump essentially eliminated the biggest success of the Obama policy, which was bringing together the major industrialized countries of the world, China and Russia and the United Nations, to put economic pressure on Iran to agree to significant controls on its nuclear program. This was the first of several steps that the Obama administration contemplated. And the next step was going to be try to find some way to convince Iran that it would be better for Iran to stop trying to destabilize countries in the region and to treat its own population better. Particularly, the Europeans were concerned about human rights in Iran. The Trump administration, by pulling out of that agreement, set back what had been a relatively clear American strategy with Iran significantly. And I think the Biden administration is trying to get back on that same track. I don't know.
And you don't think it's going to be that easy?
It's not going to be easy. It was not easy. It was unable to be accomplished when Ahmadinejad was the president of Iran. It was Rouhani's presidency that made these kinds of agreements possible. But what happened is when Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, Iranians stopped seeing any benefit of an agreement with the international community. And the international community essentially said, we can't trust the United States to keep its agreements. We may not want to engage in worldwide economic sanctions against Iran again. I think it weakened the American position significantly. I'm not trying to say that this is going to work. I just think that this is what the Biden administration wants to move toward. And I think they eventually want to have discussions with Iran that will talk about broader issues in the Iranian economy, the future of Iran, and Iranian activities in the neighborhood and beyond.
So what's the best strategy you can propose to the United States to follow in this term?
I think at the same time, there needs to be continued pressure on Iran. I think that the United States needs to work with our friends and allies in the region to make sure that they can defend themselves against aggressive Iranian actions taken on behalf of proxies. So that would be Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. There is a possibility, and I've seen people writing about it now, that very soon as the Taliban expands its control in Afghanistan, the United States and Iran might have joint interests in Afghanistan that we can begin to discuss. I have heard a number of people suggest that the best entry point to reducing tensions in the Gulf region is by finding a solution in Yemen that reduces the impact of the Houthis, but gives them a role in a new government in Yemen. So there are diplomatic paths which could help reduce Iranian adventurism over time. Although, frankly, I don't see that Iran is going to stop supporting Kataib Hezbollah. It's not going to stop supporting Lebanese Hezbollah. It's not going to stop supporting radical elements in South America. It's not going to stop supporting the Houthis until there is a larger discussion and a larger deal where Iran feels that it is more secure and gets something in exchange for giving up these strategic assets.
Which is equal to more compromise from the US and the European countries.
Sorry, I didn't hear that question. Please.
Which is equal to more compromise from the US side and the European countries.
Again, more compromise from the European countries and the United States if Iran also makes compromises. It is a negotiation. In diplomacy, you have to, if you ask something from another party, you have to be able to give them something that they also want. And if the alternative to doing nothing and to pursuing this diplomatic track that I talk about that is slow and complicated and not very politically satisfying, if the alternative to all that is a war against Iran, I think that is in no one's interest. That could destabilize the region again. It could kill tens or hundreds of thousands of people. It would cost the region and the world billions or trillions of dollars of lost economic growth and expenditures. So what I ask is, if the diplomatic path that I think the Biden administration wishes to pursue with Iran is not the right course, what is the right course? I don't think it's war, and I don't think it's doing nothing.
Okay, so let's put Iran apart and let's talk a bit about Turkey and the Turkish army and PKK conflicts, which most of it takes place in Iraqi Kurdistan region. You know, the conflict has been escalated recently. This escalation causes damage to Kurdistan region and also to Iraq in terms of civilian casualties, evacuation of villages, and harming the nature and even the agriculture and the economy of the people in the area. What role do you think the US has to play to find a solution for this crisis?
I think the United States can play a role. I served a time in Turkey and Ankara and have talked to a lot of Turks about their concerns about the PKK and their concerns about PKK bases and operation centers in northern Iraq. While I think some of that is exaggerated, I also believe that there is a real threat to parts of Turkey. And I believe that the PKK, as a terrorist organization and as a political organization, tries to keep a very tight control over all of Kurdish politics inside of Turkey. They do not like Kurdish politicians to stray very far from the line of the PKK in politics. What I think will have to happen, the United States potentially can be an arbiter between Turkey and the Kurdistan Regional Government and the government in Baghdad. There have to be more actions taken to make it less likely that the PKK fighters and supporters in the north will be able to come to cities in Kurdistan, will be able to go to Mahmur and get medical treatment or rest and relaxation. It's difficult for the Turks to see PKK fighters and politicians moving around northern Iraq and not be able to do anything about it. I think that there has to be more actions taken by the Kurdistan government and the Iraqi government to control the border. But that's only the first step. There also have to be, I know that there are good relations between Erbil and Ankara. Those probably have to be improved. And the Turks need to figure out what it is that they need the Kurdistan government and the government in Iraq, the government in Baghdad, to do to help address the question of the PKK. This is not an easy question. The PKK has been in northern Iraq for more than 3 decades. They have been conducting terrorist attacks, whether limited or significant in Turkey, on and off for more than 3 decades. Turks have had small garrisons inside northern Iraq, inside Iraqi Kurdistan for at least 20 or 25 years. So it's going to be very difficult to change the way that the Turks deal with this issue unless there is a willingness from Baghdad and from Erbil to take more concrete actions to put pressure on the PKK and try to influence their willingness to conduct cross-border attacks into Turkey, and frankly, their willingness to loosen up their political control over Kurdish parties in Turkey, some of whom would very much like to work with other Turkish parties to have a greater role in government that could potentially change some of the policies that disadvantage Kurds, especially in the southeast of the country. One of my experiences in Turkey was that I met a number of Turkish Kurds who moved from the southeast or the center of the country to the major urban areas, especially to Ankara and Istanbul, but also to Izmir, where they have been successful business people. They have joined local and provincial governments. They have joined the security services, the army, the police, and consider themselves patriotic Turkish citizens who also happen to be Kurdish and want to make sure that in doing their jobs, they look out for the rights of Kurds. This is an approach that most Turks agree with. The place where this does not work at all is the southeast, where the conditions of Turkish Kurds are the most impoverished, where the influence of the PKK is the strongest, and where a series of Turkish governments going back well before Tayyip Erdogan have decided that they must manage the problem of the PKK in southeastern Turkey through the use of force. They need to make sure that they prevent the PKK from crossing the border. And this is how Ankara sees the issue. Again, a lot of the question of the PKK depends upon the government of Turkey, depends upon the ability of Turkey to bring its own Kurdish population productively into Turkish politics. But again, to deal directly with the PKK, you're going to have to convince Turkey that Iraq and the Kurdistan region are willing to work with them to reduce or eliminate attacks from Iraq into Turkey.
Okay, it's clear. And Ambassador Suleiman, something else which I would like to talk to you about is is about 2017 and October 2017. You were the ambassador of the US by the time, and in October 2017, the Hashd al-Sha'bi forces captured territories in Kirkuk, in Sinjar, in Khanaqin, and in the Nova Plains. And by the time you were the ambassador, You know, these territories are defined as disputed areas in the article number 140 of Iraqi constitution. However, after October 2017, the implementation of this article was halted and a Arabization process resumed in these areas. What role the US, you think, have to play in getting everything back to track in these areas and resume the implementation of article number 140?
I think probably the most important thing is for there to be a more specific and unified Kurdish position on what the next step should be. Many people have talked about going back to the proposals that President Taliban, that Imam Jalal made many years back to define what Article 140 actually means. There have been a number of proposals. So I think, but there's been not even Kurdish agreement, much less agreement from Sunni or Turkmen or Christian or Yazidi communities about what Article 140 means. I think that there has to be a dialogue within Iraq, and I think the United States can help spark that dialogue. But frankly, the work that I have seen done from the United States is probably better done by private sector organizations or think tanks, non-government organizations like the U.S. Institute of Peace, which has been looking at how to find ways to change the political landscape in Kirkuk, for example, and how it can find a better relationship among the different communities that inhabit the area. This is a very small attempt in a very difficult area to try to find ways to make political deals at the local level that accommodate the views of all the parts of the population. The reality is that October of 2017 happened to a large extent because the referendum of September 2017 also happened. I remember a conversation I had in the summer of 2017 with a group of Iraqi politicians from the south of Iraq. And I asked them what they thought about the upcoming Kurdistan independence referendum. A couple of them said, we don't really care, let them go. If they don't want to be part of Iraq, we don't really need them. I talked to a couple of these politicians after the referendum happened, and actually, I think it was one of them after the October moves you talked about, and they had changed their opinion. They said, well, the Kurds tried to take territories that belonged to Iraq. They tried to take Kirkuk. They tried to take parts of Nineveh. So that was an illegitimate referendum. I think what has to happen is that there needs to be, first of all, agreement among Kurdish political factions, what they want to see, and then a real discussion between Erbil and Baghdad, but all of the political forces in Iraq about what Article 140 means. Because Article 140 doesn't only affect the boundaries between Nineveh and Duhok. It also affects the boundaries between Karbala and Anbar, between, Muthanna and Basra. It's very complicated for the rest of the country as well. If there can be a significant discussion, I think you will find that much of the rest of Iraq will be looking at their own local issues, and that it might be easier to find a series of solutions, changes to borders, or reaffirmation of provincial borders if the focus is not only on the boundaries between the Kurdistan region and the rest of the country. So it's very complicated. I think it needs to be an Iraqi dialogue because it is not only a Kurdistan issue. It is just in Kurdistan that it is most prominent because of the desire of Kurds for greater autonomy or independence now or in the future.
I see. And back to those days, were you totally aware of what was going to happen on the 16th of October as the U.S. Embassy in Iraq?
We did not know what was going to happen. And frankly, I don't think most of the Iraqi government knew what was going to happen. It appeared to be at that point a move mostly from the Hashd al-Shabi. I expected it was a move that was also supported at least tacitly by Iran as payback for the independence referendum that happened on the 25th of September. Once it started happening, we coordinated very closely and frankly put a lot of pressure on the prime minister and on our friends in the Iraqi military to stop any engagement of the Iraqi military and put as much pressure as we could through the government on the Hashid. I talked to a number of leaders of the Hashid myself at that time and put a lot of pressure on them to simply halt their forces in place. But the United States was not involved in any way planning or did we know about it. What we tried to do was limit the damage and try to find ways to begin to get local dialogues going that would reduce the tensions and permit people to get back to a more normal life along the entire line where there were territories taken over by the Hashid.
But I remember by the time a statement was released by the Americans, which stated that this movement, this military movement, was an ordinary or normal or pre-planned military movement.
I don't remember that statement, and to be perfectly honest, from my recollection, we did not know that there was going to be, for example, the movement of Hashid. We knew that there was going to be some Iraqi military movement around Kirkuk, but I think that the extent of the moves, especially from Diyala up into Sulaymaniyah and Kirkuk, we simply did not know about.
And do you think by the time the U.S. had a role to play to stop this military movement?
Well, the role the United States played, again, the military movement, I think, was a direct response to the 2017 referendum. The United States tried to convince the Kurdistan government to conduct this referendum in a different way. We had suggested that they needed a more detailed plan before conducting a referendum. What were Kurds voting for? Were they voting for what were the borders of the Kurdish state that the referendum was talking about? What was the form of government of the Kurdish state? What were who in the international community knew the details and were going to help support the creation of Kurdistan? This referendum needed to have a detailed plan coordinated with the international community. And if you look at other recent examples of countries that have gained their independence, I'm thinking of Kosovo and South Sudan, both of those independence movements were done in close cooperation with the international community, at least with the United States and Europe, in the case of Kosovo, and South Sudan with a much broader community. And it took years to plan because you have to determine borders. You have to determine a system of government. You have to find out what politics will be like, what the economy of a new country will be like. You have to figure out if there are communities in these areas that identify with other parts of the region. For Kurdistan, how will you accommodate Yazidis or Christians or Turkmen or Arabs or Shobak, for example, in an independent Kurdistan? All of these things need to be talked about and negotiated before you make a move to independence. And what you had with a quick referendum that could have had a more positive impact. It's an absolutely ridiculous claim. I have great respect, especially for Ayatollah Ali Sistani. I think that he is a great religious leader, and there are millions of Shiites across the world who look to him for their spiritual inspiration. I think that this is an attempt to blame the United States and to turn a lot of the protesters, most of whom were Shia Iraqis, against the United States. I remember a time, both in 2018 and in 2019, when the tenor of the demonstrations was very much anti-Iranian, when Shia in the South were pushing back against Shia militias that were running their neighborhoods, that were shaking down their businesses, against criminals coming from Iran who were smuggling drugs into Basra and across the border. And I remember in 2018, the burning of the Iranian consulate in Basra during the demonstrations, as well as most of the offices of the Shia political parties and the Hashid al-Shabi at that point. This is an attempt to discredit the United States. it's complete fake news. And as I said, I have great respect for His Eminence Ayatollah Sistani and for the Shia of Iraq, because it is a religion that is based in peace, that seeks the best for the people of the entire world. It is only when that religion is twisted and turned into a military organization that we have any problems with the Shiism and the way it is interpreted, in the same way that we respect Sunni Islam, but we opposed Daesh and we opposed al Qaeda because they used Sunni Islam in a political way to try to expand their influence, their wealth, and to impose their views on other people.
Okay. Ambassador Douglas Silliman, former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.